Okay, welcome to the first session in this room. Both sets of speakers this morning have indicated that they've got a lot of material to get through, so I'm not going to mess around taking valuable time introducing them, other than to say welcome Juan and Brian.
All right, guys. So as we mentioned, we have a ton of material, and I'm going to assume nobody's looked at the paper yet, so we're going to try to rush through a lot of this because we want to get to the meat of our argument, and then hopefully if you're interested, you can go dig in there. As a lot of you know, we work for Kaspersky with the great team, the Global Research and Analysis team. This is my partner in crime, Bartholomew. I'm Juan. And as we said, it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind, but for anybody who's not familiar with our work, because of GREAT and the kind of research that we do, we've been kind of at the forefront of working on a lot of these APTs and discovering a lot of these cyber espionage operations. But rather than go into any of that in particular, we wanted to deep dive into a specific aspect of this sort of research, which is attribution. And it's something that's obviously gotten very interesting recently. And I expect a lot of you as anti-malware researchers to be more or less familiar with the things that you tend to latch onto and the ways that we tend to do attribution. But we'll do a bit of a quick run through in this.
Yeah. So the first thing we got to talk about is, before we go into how to fix the problem, we got to talk about the problems themselves. When it comes to attribution, the biggest issue that I see today is that there's no real training. If you're in the government or from the government world and you're an intelligence analyst, you've probably gone through some sort of training that they have there that kind of explains how to use the right words, how to do proper attribution. Unfortunately, in the private industry, we just don't have that right now. Hopefully somebody develops a course one day, but that is a major issue. Another thing we have is visibility. So again, the government, they kind of see a lot of stuff, right? Then you have companies in the private sector that may have very good endpoint visibility or might have really good network visibility, but unfortunately, nobody has the whole picture. So when people are creating pieces and attributing attacks, a lot of times they tend to just stick with their visibility and they don't see the entire aperture. So people need to start doing that. And I'll skip through the next couple, but the last one is kind of important, is that it's really not a secret anymore. As much as all of us like to read these reports, the same thing's happening on the bad guy side, right? They're out there trolling the internet, they're reading this stuff, and basically it's becoming commonplace for them to take our research and then turn it around and use it against us. So kind of important to keep in mind.
So as I said, I expect a lot of you to be familiar with a lot of these things, but as you know, we tend to kind of latch on to, compilation times if what you're looking at is portable executable, or, we try to generate activity timelines or understand when some of these threat actors might be working. We love strings and debug paths, and you might have language resources left. And these sorts of things tend to allow you to cluster actors together, or at least get a sense of where they may be coming from. But as most of you will probably know, most if not all of these things can be manipulated. And what we want to do is, rather than continue to discuss false flags as a possibility or a vague threat, we want to just jump straight into a series of in-the-wild cases where we have seen at least some level of manipulation or deception tactics being used. In order to be able to do that, I need to ask for a certain allowance of you, which is, we as a company at Kaspersky, we don't do attribution. We're attribution agnostic, and I hope that by the end of this presentation, or if you take a glance at our paper, that you'll understand the reason for that. It isn't purely, a corporate reason. It's that we also believe that it's so fungible, it's so malleable, that it's not very wise for us to come out and say, well, this is clearly country A and B. That said, in order to have a discussion of deception tactics, we do need to be able to at least say, it is commonly believed that this is associated with Russia, this is associated with Israel, or so on. So we hope that you'll give us the distance of saying that this was heard through the attribution grapevine, this is what people normally believe, and not to attribute some of these attribution claims to us directly.
It's all Russia. Anyway, okay, so getting into the good stuff. The first group we're going to talk about today is Cloud Atlas. Hopefully a lot of you guys already know about them. They're also known as Inception. Blue Coat put out a really good paper a couple years ago about these guys. So just to go through real quick, we believe that Cloud Atlas is kind of a spin-off from Red October. Prior to the conflict, if you will, in Crimea, we noticed, there was just Red October that basically we were tracking. And
it's better, I think.
Test, test. Can you hear me better that way? Sorry, guys. So anyway, prior to the conflict in Crimea, Red October existed as one entity, but then after all of that started happening, we saw this spin-off show up, and we called them Cloud Atlas as well as others. Everybody believes that they're Eastern European based. What's really cool about them is they love to really mess with IR teams, researchers. They were pretty much one of the very first ones that we found doing a lot of these deception tactics, and they're actually active still today, still doing the things that they like to do. And why I like them, I like to call them the turducken of APT. It's kind of like, something inside of something inside of something, hence the Inception name that they came up with as well. So we started looking at them, and one of the very early documents that we had was actually Russian content, but the metadata in the document was actually showed that it was potentially created on a Spanish system. We started digging into it, and we started finding more and more of this Spanish metadata attached to a lot of these lore documents, which was kind of interesting. So at first we're like, okay, maybe these guys are Spanish APT, cool. Well, then we started finding mobile malware, and the mobile malware actually contained Arabic and Hindi strings in it. Okay, so now we have an Arabic-Spanish APT. Then what's interesting is we found a string inside of one of the malwares, and it said, "God save the Queen." What's cool about that is they actually capitalized the, which I know a lot of us dumb Americans don't tend to do that, but if you're from the UK, you make sure you capitalize the. So, okay, maybe we've got some sort of British set. Then their infrastructure was a bunch of home routers that were actually popped in South Korea. Okay, where are they coming from now? And at one point, which was really cool, they caught wind of researchers poking around on the C2s and running the malware to try to solicit, say, a stage 2. And instead of deploying their stage 2, they actually deployed a pretty well-known Chinese piece of malware to the researchers specifically. Victims were getting one stage 2, which was the real one, and if you were a researcher and they identified you or your box, they would deploy a Chinese piece of malware instead. So they knew what was up. And during compilation time, they always made it a point to actually reset their clocks. So there was really no good trend analysis you could do on when the malware was being compiled, work hours, things like that. So yeah, it left us basically in a major WTF moment. And to this day, I think they're still doing a lot of those tactics as well, so keep your eyes out for that.
So obviously, let's looking at strings and things that, very easily manipulated. And Wild Neutron is another case that had something like that, but I much prefer as an example of very different manipulation tactics and something, well, entirely different, a different paradigm. Which is to say, fine. Wild Neutron samples included Romanian for goodbye and translated to Russian for success. But I think that there's something a lot more important here, which is to say, a lot of people believe that when it comes to APT and cyber espionage, because it tends to showcase geopolitical events that are happening in the world and are generally public, that if you're looking at the tasking or the targeting, then you can more or less understand who the attacker is. So, they're attacking these sorts of people, and there's a specific country or organization that has a problem with these types of people, so it must be country X or country Y. And this is something that tends to get put in APT reports all over the place, and generally it's good thinking. However, Wild Neutron is one of those cases where we see that that paradigm breaks down very easily with a certain type of attacker, and that is a mercenary attacker. So if you look at the victim spread for Wild Neutron, they hit law firms, they hit IT companies. They were very famous because they bagged a few whales like Twitter and Apple and Microsoft, but they also went after healthcare companies, they went after mergers and acquisitions companies. Notably, for an APT, they didn't really target any government or diplomatic entities, but they did do some counterterrorism work. They were targeting radical Islamist forums. So there's no particular clear nexus of what was driving Wild Neutron, at least no one nexus. But I think that this suggests what's going to happen when it comes to mercenary groups, that a lot of the techniques that we tend to focus on to be able to at least point at a real world situation start to break down for us. Looking at another type of deception tactic, we also have the idea of covering APT activities under the guise of a lesser caliber actor. So we're going to look at a really weak version of that, one that never works, and then we're going to look at a really strong version of that I think is quite popular these days. So the weak version of that is the Lazarus group. These guys are infamous, and they're related to the whole Sony attack, and we released quite a bit of research on them recently. But if you look at a lot of the campaigns that were attributed to the Lazarus actor, every one of them tends to come under the guise of a hacktivist group that nobody has ever heard of before, has no pedigree, has no community attached to it, and the moment the attack is over, they never show up again. So this is the weak version of that. You can say, the New Romantic Cyber Army, the Whois group, the Guardians of Peace, they come in for the ransom note, and then 2 days later, they've never been heard of again, so of course the media and everybody go after the more likely culprit.
Okay, so that was the weak version. Yeah, now we're getting into the cool stuff, right? So yeah, we got the big bad bear, also known as Sofacy, APT 28, fancy bears, dancing penguins, whatever. But yeah, it's these guys. So the cool part about these guys, obviously a lot of people believe they're Russian-based, but again, we don't do attribution, so. But they have a ton of 0 days. These guys are extremely well-resourced. They've targeted everything from domestic media to foreign media to counterterrorism targets to dissidents or activists within the country, foreign intelligence services. They've pretty much hit everybody, which is really kind of interesting because usually government organizations, if they're an intelligence agency, they usually have certain slices of the pie that they tend to stick with. These guys don't really do that. They've got a huge amount of infrastructure, and again, with the 0 days and different C2 servers and things that they have, they've got a ton of money behind them. The really cool part about them is they love to just jack with people all the time. That's like their MO currently. Before I get into the 3 examples that we did, I just want to say that this stuff was done back in February. We had presented this back at CanSec West, and at the time, it was kind of a really touchy subject. A lot of people were, how do you know that's them? And are they really doing this? And now, with the recent events that have occurred over the summer, the DC leaks, the DNC stuff, fancybears.net, they actually created at one point. Now it's almost become commonplace. The media picked up on it, everybody talks about it, and now it's just a normal thing to accept, which is kind of interesting. So we're going to present the older stuff before the summer things happen, but just keep that in mind when I'm going through it.
It turns into a bit of an interesting caveat to be able to look at it as a trend. So for a lot of people, it was a kind of a surprising idea that they would do some of the things that happened over the summer. For us, we'd like to at least show what they were already doing in this space so that you can understand it more of as a linear buildup in their tactics.
Right. So the first one is Ukraine. So basically, enter Cyber Berkut. So around, I guess, 2015, the leader of Ukraine, Yanukovych, got ousted, fled to southern Russia. He's believed to be in exile there. And around the same time, the parliament disbanded the Berkut, the secretive police for him. Right after that happened, Cyber Berkut popped up on stage. Now, before this happened, there's no, again, as Juan kind of alluded to earlier, there's really no pedigree here. Most of the people that were involved either were completely unknown or there was just really nothing there to show where they came from. I'll skip through some of this stuff to get this sped up. So yeah, they started basically hitting Ukraine, and their sole purpose was basically just to mess with the masses. They were going through, they targeted NATO at first. They actually hit some election systems. They hacked some billboards and broadcast propaganda. They hit the government directly, blocked cell phone calls, dumped a bunch of emails from the government out there. Anything they could do to cause essentially unrest, distrust in the public, to kind of further the, I guess, the agenda of what you could consider was Russia. Now, why would somebody be doing this? Obviously, it's plausible deniability, right? You don't want to have a team that everyone pretty much attributes to Russian intelligence to be pegged with doing this type of thing. Back when this was going on, again, it wasn't commonplace. It wasn't widely accepted. So standing up a front to do kind of your dirty work, your laundry that you don't want to be exposed as, is essentially why this happened. So moving on from that, the US, NATO, they got a little ticked off about certain things that were happening, and we started threatening sanctions and other stuff against Russia. Well, right around the same time, Cyber Caliphate came on board. If anybody's familiar with these guys, they were essentially, I guess, the anonymous arm of ISIS, supposedly. So they came on, the same thing. There was no history, there's no pedigree associated with these guys, and they hit what's really interesting. I thought it was kind of comical. They hit CENTCOM's Twitter account and also Newsweek, and they broadcast the picture at the bottom there. That's a screenshot from one of the Twitter accounts. But basically, you know, if you log in and you follow CENTCOM on Twitter and all of a sudden you see ISIS propaganda coming across, that's kind of messed up, right? So they started with that. Then they started hitting some media outlets. They actually hit some stuff out in Albuquerque, I believe. And then what was interesting is they hit some media outlets in Baltimore and in Maryland and actually got a hold of the text alerting system. And they started texting people that subscribe to those news agencies with ISIS propaganda. So you've got Joe Schmo sitting in his basement, you know, over on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he gets a magical text from the local news station saying ISIS is coming to get you. It's kind of messed up. Then they also, their more famous one was they hit TV5 in France, and they were actually able to black out the channels. I think it was like 11 channels nationwide or something that they were able to black out and ultimately broadcast some propaganda across too. So all of this stuff, if you're interested in how this is tied to Sofacy, again, refer to the paper. There's definitely some things you could latch onto there. So moving on, then in 2015, later on, about 4 months later, Saudi started conducting bombing raids and runs into Yemen because of an uprising that was occurring. And again, another group pops up, no pedigree before, and it's the Yemen Cyber Army, or YCA. So they showed up, a lot of people immediately jumped on board, and they started saying, well, this is Iran, this is totally Iran. We were one of those, I still am kind of, but as we started looking a little more, they started off, they hit the London-based Al Hayat newspaper, and then what was more important was they ended up dumping a ton of data from Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What's interesting about this is back in February, 2 months prior, we actually knew that Sofacy was on Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs networks already. There was an embassy in Ukraine that was actually hit, and we suspect that Sofacy had pulled or taken all this data off of the ministry's networks and then saw kind of an opening or an opportunity to go ahead and conduct another, you know, smear tactic against a country that essentially is one of their enemies at this point. And again, the TTPs follow the same type of thing as the last two. On top of that, there's actually some infrastructure that is linked to the early registration of their domains. And again, refer to the paper if you really need to look at all that stuff.
All right, so let's move beyond the idea of pegging the blame on a lesser group. Instead, to the idea of an APT trying to put the blame on another APT group. Since these are becoming so well known, threat actors become so well known, it might actually be easier to say, you know what, it wasn't Dooku, but rather it's APT1. And that's what's happening with this example, which I'm just going to have to blaze through because we don't have a great deal of time. But as some of you know, the Dooku 2 samples, at least a 64-bit kernel driver, I believe, included the ugly gorilla handle, which is Wang Dong's handle. It's kind of patently ridiculous to consider that that's who was behind Dooku 2, but it is at least a nice tactic to divert an IR team that might have no greater context than just to Google some strings. The better version of that is something that we call Tiger Milk, and this is an unpublished bit of research. It was pushed out to our private subscribers last year. And what's interesting about Tiger Milk is it's a targeted attack against a specific country. It was active for about 6 months. It was going after Peru military organizations and certain government organizations. And the malware isn't great. It's doing memory ejection. It's clunky. It would have caused some errors in the system. But every single one of the backdoors and every single one of the components was signed with this certificate. And I don't know if anybody in the crowd might recognize what the certificate is. You can yell it out. But this is the same certificate as was used in Stuxnet A and B. This is the Realtek certificate that was presumably stolen and used for these first two samples. And as a lot of you probably know, this was invalidated and has been invalidated for years. So signing those samples with the certificate serves no practical value as far as the attack phase goes. other than, hopefully, from the attacker's perspective, to mislead investigators into thinking that it's the same infamous, well-known team. So I guess the real question behind Tiger Milk is, how the hell did they get the certificate?
All right, so the last one will kind of blaze through because of time, but it's Turla. Hopefully everybody's kind of familiar with these guys, also believed to be Russian. And I really like them. I've spent a lot of time looking at these guys. People have them traced back to around 1997, potentially involved with Moonlight Maze. If you want to read more, refer to Thomas Ridd's book. But what's really cool about these guys is their OPSEC is pretty awesome. They're pretty in tune with victims. They watch the victim boxes and they make sure that they're not being watched by, say, IR team or researchers of some sort. There's a specific incident that I'd like to talk about that we kind of call Faking Dragon. Maybe a few of you have heard it before. But essentially what happened was there was this extremely important victim that had been compromised. And they figured it out. They called in their IR team, and the IR team started watching this system. Well, at the same time, they ran some tools, and it seems like Turla picked up on it. And what happened was they had originally deployed Whipbot, which is their stage 1, and the IR team was kind of sitting back and waiting to see the stage 2. But instead of pushing the big bad snake, which everybody was expecting, they ended up pushing Quarian, which at the time was actually a very rare, lesser-known Chinese-based APT, or a piece of malware. So, obviously, what the hell? Well, at the time, like I said, it wasn't known what Quarian was. So what essentially happened was it sent these researchers down a really deep rabbit hole. And while that was happening, this is the infrastructure, by the way. It all pointed back to Beijing. And it's believed that the infrastructure wasn't even controlled by Turla. It was just basically to send the researchers off on the side. But it was pretty cool because while the researchers were looking down this rabbit hole and trying to figure out what is this malware and eventually came to the conclusion that it's Chinese-based, Turla had used that to their advantage and actually backed out all of their other stuff. So they left no trace and they were gone. But it's a pretty interesting example of how people do watch victim boxes. They do watch who calls back to their C2 servers, and they'll react to that. Other theories, obviously, Turla's Chinese. Maybe they're working with China, but no, I don't think so. So, okay, real quick, this is the important part of the talk, and it looks like we have a few minutes. So why we're talking about this. In general, the first thing we need to do is kind of address the level of attribution that happens in products out there. And I like to break it down into basically 3 different groups. If you're government, if you're private sector, and believe it or not, the media actually plays a really important role here. So it's basically what level do you need? Well, as the government, if you're going to be leveraging sanctions or demarches or conducting cyber operations back at another country, you really need to have that level of fidelity, right? You have to go as deep as what unit was involved, down to individuals. If you want to, basically issue wanted posters for 3 PLA members, you need that kind of level. And moving on, for the private sector, unfortunately, we all like to have the individual attribution. We all like to write papers that show pictures of people walking around with their children, but that's really not needed. And I think it's a little irresponsible. But if you look at it, what you need is you need attribution kind of directed towards where your resources are, right? So if you're doing business in China and you're not doing business in South America, you probably just need the level of attribution as to where this, the country of origin, basically. So you can kind of redirect your resources and focus on where it needs to be. The more important portion here is the media. So a lot of times when the media catches wind of a story, refer to the summer incidents, they want any level. The first thing they ask for is whodunit, right? I want to know who's responsible, who's behind the attacks, show me a picture, where do they live, whatever. Unfortunately, at the same time, they don't tend to ask why. A lot of times we've had journalists kind of come and ask this question, but then they don't question why you actually attribute it to something. So I'd like, for people to think about that in the future. Question the researchers and ask them exactly why they're attributing things.
Similarly, we'd like to be able to leave people with some conclusions and takeaways and at least shape some of the conversation that we hope starts up around this. And I want to run through it quickly so that we might actually have time for questions. But essentially, it's becoming more and more important for us to be able to define what the value of threat intelligence is and what the contribution is. And I think one of the really important parts in that is to be able to differentiate it from what IT and IR are providing. I think that the main thing that threat intelligence provides is actually historical context. It's the one main feed of data, or at least the one main feature that you actually need to be able to differentiate in the past cases that we were just discussing, whether you're having your chain yanked, or if you actually are looking at the team that you should be looking at. At the same time, I think that we need to have some conversations about who can actually do attribution. And presumably, since most of the people here are anti-malware researchers or working with endpoint companies and so on, the truth is that we're not the right people to do attribution. We're not in a position to actually do attribution. If the measure of solid attribution or of ultimate fidelity is going to be something like a PCAP, then the people best suited to be doing attribution are probably the SIGINT agencies, the gods on the wires that get to see so many of these things. And sadly, that's where you get into kind of like this Greek myth Cassandra type of situation, where the institutions that are best positioned to see everything are also the ones that won't be believed. Because when we see some of these major attacks, these stories start to conveniently leak saying, well, the IC, the intelligence community is suggesting that it's North Korea or so on. And everybody goes, well, if you can't substantiate your case, we don't care for it. So there's a bit of a trade-off there.
All right, so lastly, there's some takeaways here. And, if you take anything out of this presentation, it's these last 3 or 4 questions, things to ask yourself if you do produce threat intelligence or do attribution in any way. So the first one is basically, a lot of companies like to talk about hacking back. Are you willing to really stick your neck out and offer a service like that or do something like that when we've just shown that there's just a few examples and there's tons more of instances where attribution it's really, really muddy. A lot of times you're never going to get 100%. And in cases like this, people really need to second guess before they start reacting to things just based on what a few researchers say. Again, the level of attribution, when you're doing this, if you're a consumer especially, try to think about, what level do I really need? Don't pressure people into trying to say this is, GRU, right? If you can say it's Russian-based or Eastern European, or it follows, their methods or things like that, that's really what you need. And to go along with that, even it's just the clustering of activity, the group names, for example. Do you really need to know if you're a bank that, it's 3PLA or a specific unit, or do you need to know that it's APT1 and understand the TTPs of APT1? Kind of a question to think about. If you're in the government, obviously, different story. But for the majority of us here, just keeping it within groups is probably sufficient. And lastly, if you're a producer of threat intelligence and you're out there writing reports like this, you're trying to do attribution, think about what actionable intelligence you're actually putting in your report. Are you writing a 20-page blog or report on, an actor and putting lots of sexy pictures in and talking about who they are? But in reality, at the end of the day, there's nothing in that paper that a consumer would be able to take and use to, defend on their networks or to understand the actor a little bit better. Super important. Just think about it. Make sure you put IOCs in. Make sure you, substantiate your claims if you are going to do any sort of attribution.
So that was kind of a whirlwind tour of what's covered in what was kind of a 20-page paper. I think it was condensed down to like 10 or 11. I like to kind of run on if you read my paper from last year. I hope that people find it interesting and that it's the beginning of a conversation a little bit more high level about some of these issues that we're facing and why they're particularly important, as I'm sure a lot of you have latched onto over the past few months with what's going on with some of our Sofacy friends. I don't know if we have time for questions. It would be great if we could. If not, we'll be more than happy to.
I think we've got time for one quick question. There's someone down here.
To the closing keynote in the front.
This is actually a question, not around. But no, I love the talk, and I think there's a lot we can chat about at the bar afterwards. But I guess the question I'd have is, with the attribution thing, how much of this is our own fault that we end up feeling pressured to do attribution? Like, I kind of feel this is a bit of our own making, so I was wondering if you could.
Yeah, and this is something that I touched upon with the last paper, and I tried not to go into so much in this one, but I think it has to do with the structure of the industry and where we're at right now and what value we're getting back from threat intelligence. While organizations are still trying to figure out why they need us and what they can benefit from getting our products and so on, in the meantime, the great value of threat intelligence for companies is PR. And it's hard to really continue to convince journalists that they should be writing about all this super cool stuff if you don't come to them and say, hey, here's this real world geopolitical situation that a lot of people are interested in for you to write about. So you end up getting cornered and saying, this person doesn't really give a damn about what kind of memory injection they're using. They want to hear that it was, this country and this organization perpetrating this horrendous act. So until the value of threat intelligence becomes more clear in a corporate sense, in a consumable sense, or even in a public value sense, and it's not about the sexy whodunit, we're kind of screwed into that situation.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Please show your appreciation. I'm sure these guys will gladly answer questions in the bar later.